My family let my siblings steal my identity and ruin my credit, then acted shocked when the police finally got involved. The envelope was heavier than it should have been, thick paper folded with intention instead of routine. I stood in my kitchen holding it with both hands, reading the return address twice, then a third time, waiting for recognition to settle in. It didn't. The language inside was formal, exact, and completely unfamiliar to my life. Account numbers I'd never seen, dates that didn't match any decision I'd made, a balance that felt detached from reality, followed by a sentence that carried weight without raising its voice. Immediate action required. I didn't feel fear. I felt confusion sharpen into focus. I sat down, placed the letter flat on the table, and read it again, slower. It referenced obligations tied to my name, my social security number, my credit profile. It outlined consequences that already existed, not warnings about what might happen later. This wasn't a threat. It was a summary. I knew, without hesitation, that I had never opened what they described. No application, no signature, no consent. The certainty didn't come from memory gaps or denial. It came from knowing how careful I'd always been, how boring my financial life actually was. What unsettled me wasn't the letter itself. It was how little shock I felt. My breathing stayed steady. My hands didn't shake. Instead, a quiet awareness surfaced, the kind that forms when something finally aligns with patterns you've ignored. I checked my phone and saw missed calls from earlier in the day. Family members. Short messages asking if I'd gotten anything strange. That phrasing landed heavier than the notice in my hands. They weren't asking what it was. They were checking whether I'd seen it yet. I pulled my credit report that afternoon, not in panic, but with precision. Line by line, it confirmed what the paper implied. Accounts existed that shouldn't. Activity had been ongoing, not recent. This wasn't an error created by a system glitch or a misplaced digit. It had duration. It had maintenance. Someone had cared enough to keep it alive. As I scrolled, names and addresses appeared that weren't mine, yet none of it felt random. It felt organized. By evening, I understood that the letter wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the first moment the outside world acknowledged it. The situation hadn't slipped through unnoticed. It had been allowed to continue. Access hadn't been forced. Information hadn't been stolen from strangers. It had moved through familiar hands, in familiar spaces, without resistance. That realization settled calmly, without anger, because it explained too much to ignore. I folded the notice back into its envelope and placed it somewhere visible, not to remind myself to act, but to mark the moment clearly. Whatever came next would involve names, records, and consequences, but the foundation had already been laid long before the law entered the picture. The damage didn't start with fraud. It started with permission. In my family, I was the one who didn't cause problems. I paid my bills on time. I showed up when I said I would. I didn't ask for much and rarely needed help. If something went wrong, I handled it quietly and moved on. That became my role early on, and it stuck. I was seen as steady, capable, and low maintenance. People trusted that I would manage, no matter what landed on my plate. My sibling was treated very differently. There was always something going on with them. Missed payments, lost jobs, bad choices followed by apologies. The word everyone used was struggling. It wasn't said with anger, more like concern mixed with habit. When things fell apart for them, the response wasn't correction, it was cushioning. Mistakes were explained away. Consequences were delayed or softened. Help arrived quickly, even when it didn't fix anything long-term. My parents leaned hard toward keeping things calm. They avoided tension whenever possible, choosing silence when accountability risked an argument. Peace mattered more than fairness. The goal was always to get through the moment without a blow-up, even if it meant problems stayed unresolved. Because I didn't push back, I became the easy option. If something needed to be handled, it came to me. If a mess had to be cleaned up, I was expected to do it without complaint. I didn't make scenes, so I was trusted to absorb discomfort. Over time, that expectation became normal. It wasn't discussed. It didn't need to be. Everyone just assumed I would take care of things. What made me vulnerable wasn't carelessness. It was trust mixed with predictability. I didn't lock everything down because I didn't think I had to. I believed that being reliable meant being safe. I believed that family boundaries existed even if they were never spoken out loud. I thought responsibility protected me. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. When my sibling crossed a line, The response was to protect them from fallout. When that protection needed a buffer, I was used without being asked. Not because anyone hated me, but because I was convenient. I could handle it. I always did. That system worked for years because I didn't question it. I didn't demand balance. I didn't force hard conversations. I played my part well, and the cost stayed hidden. By the time real damage appeared, the habits were already set, and I was the one standing in the middle of it, exactly where I'd always been placed. Access didn't come from hacking or stolen files. It came from familiarity. In our house, important papers lived in common places. A drawer, a folder on a shelf, mail left on the kitchen counter until someone sorted it. Nothing was locked away because no one believed it needed to be. Birth records, tax forms, old loan papers, insurance letters, all of it passed through shared space. I never thought twice about it. It was home. My social security number existed on documents I'd signed years earlier. Job forms, school records, bank paperwork from when I was younger. Some of those were filled out with help from my parents, back when that was normal. Copies were made. Originals were stored. Over time, the line between private and shared blurred. Not because of carelessness, but because of comfort. Everyone knew where things were. Everyone had seen them before. There was also quiet pressure to help in the past. Co-signing questions that came up casually. Just in case. Only for a little while. I had said no more than once. But the conversations themselves revealed how easily my information could be referenced. Names spoken out loud. Numbers read off forms. Details shared in rooms where nothing felt risky. I trusted that those moments stayed exactly where they happened. Mail was another opening. Letters arrived with my name on them, even when I wasn't home. Someone would set them aside, sometimes open them by mistake, sometimes not. I didn't track it closely. I didn't feel the need. If something looked important, I assumed it would be handed to me. That belief rested on one simple idea. Family doesn't cross lines like that. Because of that belief, I never checked for misuse. I didn't freeze anything. I didn't lock files away. I didn't imagine someone would take pieces of my identity and use them as tools. That kind of thinking belonged to strangers, not people I ate dinner with. I trusted the setting more than I trusted systems, and I thought that was reasonable. The truth is, nothing had to be broken into. No barrier needed to be forced. The details were already available, sitting quietly where they'd always been. Access didn't require effort. It only required willingness. Everything they needed was already inside the house. The first sign didn't come with drama. It arrived quietly, wrapped in a normal moment I expected to go smoothly. I had applied for something simple, something routine, and I wasn't worried about the outcome. When the response came back, it didn't match that expectation. The answer was no. Not a soft delay or a request for more details, but a clean denial. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, waiting for it to make sense. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Systems mess up, numbers get crossed, files get mixed, and that explanation felt reasonable. I checked my information again to make sure nothing had been entered wrong. Everything looked fine. My name was spelled correctly. My details were accurate. There was no reason for a problem to exist. What unsettled me was the tone of the response. It wasn't cautious or unsure. It read like a decision based on history, not a single request. That pushed me to ask for more clarity. When I did, the answer came back with words I hadn't expected to see tied to me. Risk, outstanding issues, prior activity. None of it lined up with the life I knew I was living. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. I told myself there had to be an error somewhere outside my control. Maybe something old I'd forgotten about. Maybe a mix-up with someone who had a similar name. I stayed calm because panic didn't fit the facts I believed were true. I had never missed anything major. I hadn't taken on hidden debt. I hadn't made reckless choices. That was when I decided to look for myself. I had never pulled a full credit report before. I didn't see the need. I expected to find something clean and boring that would confirm the denial was wrong. When the report loaded, my focus narrowed. Lines appeared that didn't belong. Accounts I didn't recognize. Activity that stretched back farther than the recent past. I didn't accuse anyone, not even in my head. I didn't reach for blame. I just sat there, scrolling slowly, trying to understand how something I'd never touched could be connected to me so completely. The confusion wasn't loud. It was heavy. And for the first time, the problem felt real, even though I still didn't know where it came from. Once I stopped looking at the report as a mistake, the details started to stand out. There were several accounts listed, not just one, different lenders, Different dates, different balances. Some were recent, others went back years. I moved slowly through each page, trying to connect them to any moment I could remember. Nothing matched. The spending didn't line up with my habits, the locations were wrong, and the timing clashed with where I had been living or working. What made it worse was how complete it all looked. These weren't half-formed attempts or small slips. Every entry showed planning. Applications had been filled out correctly. Payments were made for a while, then stopped. Limits were pushed, then maxed. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. Whoever did this knew how credit worked and how long they could ride each account before moving on. I noticed addresses I had never used. Some were places I'd only heard of in passing. Others were familiar in an uncomfortable way, tied to family locations I hadn't lived in for years. Each line felt like proof that someone had walked through my life, wearing my name while I wasn't looking. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't one bad choice. It was a pattern repeated over time. Charges told their own story. Stores I never shopped at. Services I never signed up for. Amounts that didn't fit my income or priorities. I wasn't careless with money, yet here was a record that painted me as reckless and unreliable. Seeing that version of myself on paper felt unreal, like reading about a stranger who somehow shared my identity. What shook me most was how long it had gone on. This didn't start last month or last year. It stretched across stages of my life where I remembered being careful, even cautious. While I was saving, someone else was spending. While I was building, another person was burning through credit under my name. The contrast made my hands shake, not from fear, but from disbelief. As I scanned one section again, something small caught my eye. A name appeared in notes tied to more than one account. Not mine. It showed up quietly, almost hidden, but it was there more than once. That was the moment confusion turned into clarity. This wasn't random. This wasn't anonymous. One name kept appearing where mine should have been. It didn't hit all at once. The understanding arrived slowly as I compared what I was seeing with what I already knew. Certain purchases stood out. The brands matched tastes that were never mine. The timing lined up with periods when I had been out of town, busy, or barely scraping by. Meanwhile, someone else had been living louder, looser, spending in ways I never allowed myself. That contrast kept pulling my thoughts in one direction, even before I was ready to say it out loud. Addresses told the rest of the story. A few locations were places I had never stayed, yet they weren't random. They were tied to someone I knew well. Places I had visited, sat in, argued in, left behind. Each one formed a quiet line back to the same source. I didn't feel shock anymore. What I felt was a heavy stillness, the kind that settles when a question finally finds its answer. I went through the charges again, slower this time. Patterns emerged that I couldn't ignore. Small payments at first, just enough to keep accounts alive. Then larger amounts once limits increased. That rhythm mirrored how my sibling handled money whenever help was offered. Careful at the start, reckless once things felt secure. Seeing that behavior written into my credit history made my stomach tighten, not from anger, but from recognition. There was no single moment where I said the name in my head. I didn't need to. Certainty doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just removes doubt. By the time I reached the final page, I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew who had done this, and I knew they hadn't done it alone. Access like this doesn't happen without silence, without someone looking away when questions should be asked. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send messages or demand answers. Confrontation felt useless without a plan. I needed facts, not excuses. I needed proof that didn't rely on raised voices or denial. So I stayed quiet and kept reading, saving copies, writing dates down, building a picture that couldn't be brushed aside later. What surprised me most wasn't the betrayal. It was how calm I felt once the truth settled. Confusion had been worse. Doubt had been heavier. Now there was only clarity. I understood what had happened, who benefited, and why no one had stopped it. That certainty didn't bring relief, but it gave me something more important. It gave me direction. When I finally spoke to them, I kept my voice even. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise old fights. I simply laid out what I had found and said I needed help fixing it. The room stayed calm in a way that felt wrong. No one looked shocked. No one asked how this happened. Instead, there was a pause, followed by sighs that sounded tired rather than concerned. My parents were the first to respond. They said everyone makes mistakes, that stress can push people into bad choices. They reminded me how hard things had been lately for my sibling, how unstable and overwhelming their situation was. The focus shifted quickly, away from what had been done and toward how difficult their life had been. I stood there listening, realizing no one was actually denying what happened. They were just explaining why it shouldn't matter as much. Then came the suggestions. Maybe I could talk to the banks quietly. Maybe it would be easier if I handled it myself instead of making trouble. One of them mentioned that paying it off might be faster than fighting it. They said dragging police into it would ruin lives. They spoke as if the damage was an inconvenience, not a violation. Every sentence carried the same message. Keep this contained, keep it peaceful, keep it off the record. What hurt most wasn't the lack of anger toward my sibling. It was the pressure placed on me. I was told I was strong enough to absorb this. I was reminded that I had always been responsible. They said I could recover, while my sibling might not. Responsibility was framed as obligation, not choice. My credit, my future, my clean record were treated like tools meant to protect someone else. I asked, once, why no one had stopped it. The question didn't land. It floated past them, unanswered. There was more concern about family image than personal damage, more fear of conflict than care for fairness. I saw then that this wasn't just about money or fraud. It was about a system that expected me to carry weight quietly so others could avoid consequences. As the conversation ended, nothing was resolved. No plan was made to fix the harm. No promise of support was offered. I was left holding the same burden, only now with the knowledge that it had been noticed and still ignored. Walking away, I felt something settle inside me, heavy but clear. That was the moment I understood the balance sheet didn't show the worst loss. The debt could be challenged. Scores could be rebuilt. What couldn't be repaired was the way my safety had been traded for comfort. After that talk, the message became clearer, even though no one said it straight. I was asked to pause, to not take steps that might draw attention. The tone stayed soft, almost caring, but the meaning underneath was firm. They said bringing outside help would make things messy. They warned that once certain doors open, they never close again. It was framed as advice, yet it felt like instruction. Embarrassment sat at the center of every concern. Not the damage to my record, not the stress I was already carrying. They worried about neighbors finding out, about extended relatives asking questions, about stories spreading that could not be controlled. Reputation mattered more than repair. I was told this could stay private if I chose the right path. Quiet solutions were praised as mature. Noise was painted as reckless. When I mentioned involving authorities, the reaction shifted. Faces tightened. Voices dropped. I was told that would be extreme, that I was taking things too far. Someone said I was letting emotions guide me. Another reminded me that mistakes should be handled inside the home. The problem was no longer what happened, but how I might respond to it. Accountability was treated like aggression. The pressure didn't come as a demand. It came as concern for everyone else. They spoke about stress levels, health, fragile situations. They hinted that consequences would ripple outward, hurting people who were already struggling. My role, once again, was to absorb the impact so balance could return. Staying quiet was presented as kindness. I listened without interrupting. Each sentence added weight to a choice I hadn't fully named yet. If I stayed silent, things would stay calm on the surface. If I spoke up, I would become the source of trouble. The framing was careful, designed to make responsibility feel like guilt. By the end, I understood what they wanted from me. Not truth, not repair. They wanted stillness. They wanted this buried. And they wanted me to carry the cost so no one else had to face what they allowed. I tried to handle everything the way they asked. I called lenders one by one and explained that the accounts were not mine. I filled out forms, sent letters, and waited on hold for hours. Each step took time and patience. Some places listened. Others didn't care. Without reports from authorities, many treated my claims as weak. They wanted proof I couldn't provide on my own. I also explored payment options, not because I accepted blame, but because I needed relief. I looked at plans that stretched years into the future. The numbers were heavy, yet I told myself this was temporary. I believed that if I showed effort, things might calm down. I hoped responsibility would inspire change somewhere else in the family. While I worked through this, nothing shifted on the other side. New notices appeared. Old balances grew. Activity continued in ways that showed no fear. It became clear that silence had been read as safety. My attempts to clean the mess quietly didn't slow anything down. They removed urgency instead. Each night ended the same way. staring at papers that felt endless. I was tired, not just from the work, but from carrying this alone. I had followed every suggestion meant to keep peace, yet peace never arrived. What I gained instead was proof that quiet repair only protects the person causing harm. By the time another letter arrived, I finally understood the lesson I had been teaching without meaning to. Handling it softly showed that limits did not exist. Fixing it quietly only taught them nothing would happen. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. An apartment application stalled without explanation. A background check flagged something that shouldn't exist. A routine insurance quote came back higher than expected, followed by a quiet rejection. Every step forward hit an invisible wall, and I couldn't see it until I was already pressed against it. Housing became the first real barrier. Places I could afford suddenly required scores I no longer had. Managers smiled, then stopped calling. Emails ended with polite phrases that meant no. I wasn't being judged for who I was, but for a record that told a story I didn't live. I had done everything right, yet doors closed anyway. Work wasn't spared either. A role that fit my skills moved forward smoothly until paperwork entered the process. After that, responses slowed, then vanished. No explanation was offered. I knew better than to ask directly. The answer was already written somewhere I couldn't erase yet. Progress stalled through no fault I could explain in an interview. Even simple things carried weight. A phone plan required a deposit. A car policy cost more for less coverage. Each reminder showed how far the damage reached. This wasn't abstract harm. It shaped daily choices, limited options, and turned basic stability into a struggle. When I shared these impacts, the reaction stayed distant. There was sympathy in words, not action. I was told setbacks happen. I was reminded that things could be worse. No one connected these losses back to the choices that caused them. The cost kept landing on me alone. That was when it became clear this wasn't just about fixing numbers on a report. My future was being narrowed in real time, while the people who helped cause it stayed untouched. The collapse wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and isolating, blocking paths I hadn't even reached yet. I asked to speak with everyone together, not to argue, but to be clear. I said I couldn't keep carrying this alone. I explained that the damage was growing and that quiet fixes had failed. My voice stayed level. I didn't list every loss or raise my tone. I simply said the next step would involve a report, because that was the only way left to stop it and begin repairs. The reaction came fast and sharp. My parents stared at me like I had crossed a line that mattered more than what had already happened. They said I was being extreme. They asked how I could even think about doing that to family. The word betrayal was used, not for what had been done to me, but for what I was planning to do next. It felt like the rules had flipped in real time. My sibling barely reacted. There was no apology, no fear, no sign of regret. They shrugged and said things had gotten out of hand. They blamed stress, timing, bad luck. Not once did they say my name with care. Not once did they acknowledge the damage is real. Listening to that made something settle inside me. I wasn't dealing with confusion. I was facing comfort with harm. I repeated myself, slower this time. I said I would file a report and that I needed my record protected. I explained this wasn't about punishment, but safety. The words landed flat. My parents talked over me, warning about consequences, about records, about how this would follow everyone forever. No one asked how it was already following me. Anger replaced disbelief. Voices rose. I was told I was tearing the family apart. I was accused of choosing systems over blood. Each sentence pushed responsibility away from where it belonged. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that they believed I would back down. They had seen me absorb damage before. They expected the same ending again. I stood up when the conversation stopped going in circles. I didn't slam doors or make threats. I said what would happen next and left. As I walked away, I understood something important. They weren't refusing to hear me. They were counting on me to stay quiet like always. They thought I was bluffing. I went alone, early, before doubt could grow teeth. The building was quiet, fluorescent lights buzzing like tired insects. A desk officer asked why I was there, and I slid the folder forward without drama. Papers, timelines, numbers that never belonged to me. My voice stayed, even while explaining how accounts appeared without consent. There was no shaking, no need for anger. Facts carried enough weight. Forms followed. Names, dates, addresses written carefully, slowly. Each line felt like lifting something heavy off my chest, and placing it down where it could finally be seen. Copies were scanned, originals returned, a receipt printed. Nothing cinematic happened. No raised voices. No instant justice. Just process beginning to move. Questions came next, plain and direct. When did you notice? Where did access exist? Did anyone admit involvement? I answered without decoration. There was relief and clarity. The story didn't need emotion to stand upright. It only needed truth arranged in order. Afterward, I sat in my car with the engine off, breathing through a strange calm. Fear didn't arrive. Guilt stayed away. What settled instead was stillness, like a room after furniture gets removed. For the first time in months, the future felt possible again, not friendly, just reachable. Notifying banks came later. Calls placed. Reports referenced. Disputes reopened with authority behind them. Representatives listened differently once a case number existed. Language shifted. Options appeared. Timelines formed. Progress became real, not promised. Family messages arrived that evening, sharp and confused. I didn't answer right away. Silence felt earned. This step wasn't about punishment or spectacle. Protection mattered more than approval. Repair mattered more than comfort. Sleep came easier that night, not because problems vanished, but because responsibility finally sat where it belonged. I hadn't chosen conflict. I chose safety. The moment paperwork left my hands, control returned, quiet and solid, without applause. The reaction arrived fast, loud, and strangely rehearsed. Calls stacked up. Messages came from different numbers, all carrying the same tone of disbelief. They spoke as if something sacred had been broken, not as if damage had finally been named. Voices trembled with outrage, yet none asked how this had happened or how long it had gone on. Instead, they asked how I could do this to them. They said trust was gone, that I chose strangers over blood, that this step would destroy futures, shame the family, and stain names that mattered more than truth. Each sentence leaned on drama, not facts. The past months vanished from their memory. The nights I couldn't sleep, the doors closed to me, the warnings I gave, all erased. In their version, nothing existed until authority stepped in. What unsettled me most was the surprise they performed. Wide disbelief. Hurt voices. Shock layered so thick it almost sounded real. They spoke as if this came from nowhere, as if I hadn't sat at tables explaining consequences in plain terms, as if silence had not been requested, as if patience had not been demanded from me alone. Blame shifted quickly. I was called cold. I was told I lacked loyalty. Some said I overreacted. Others claimed I moved too fast. No one mentioned the accounts. No one named the harm. Responsibility floated around the room, never landing where it belonged. Listening felt different now. Their words no longer pulled me back into old roles. I heard fear, not confusion. I heard loss of control, not concern. The shock was not about what happened. It was about what I stopped carrying for them. When the calls slowed, quiet returned. In that stillness, clarity stayed. They weren't stunned by the truth. They were rattled because the truth no longer needed their approval to exist. Once the report existed, the story stopped belonging to the family. It moved into rooms where tone and history carried no weight. Officers asked for records, not feelings. Dates, signatures, and patterns mattered. I handed over copies and answered questions without framing anyone as good or bad. Facts stood on their own, steady and plain. Calls came from investigators next. They spoke calmly, without judgment. They didn't ask why someone might have done this. They asked how it was done and when it started. Accounts were traced. Addresses compared. Timelines lined up. Each step pulled the situation farther from opinion and closer to proof. What once felt blurry became sharp. The difference was clear right away. Excuses that worked at home meant nothing here. Struggle did not cancel harm. Need did not excuse theft. Love did not erase damage. No one asked me to be patient. No one suggested I cover the cost. Responsibility had a name now, and it wasn't mine. Family voices changed again as updates came through. Confidence faded. Certainty cracked. Some tried new angles, offering partial truth or soft explanations. Others went quiet. Control slipped because the ending was no longer theirs to shape. Outcomes followed rules, not feelings. I noticed something else during that time. My own role shrank. I wasn't the fixer anymore. I wasn't the shield. I was a witness with paperwork. That distance brought relief. I didn't have to argue or defend my choice. Process did that work for me. Waiting was slow but steady. Each notice felt heavy, yet cleaner than before. There was comfort in structure. One step led to the next, answers opening new actions. Nothing rushed, nothing hidden. When it settled into motion, I understood what changed most. Authority replaced denial. Evidence replaced stories. The family no longer guided what happened next. For the first time since this began, the path forward did not depend on silence or sacrifice. It moved on its own, firm and clear, without asking anyone's permission. When word reached them, the response came wrapped in injury, not regret. Messages arrived explaining how this was unfair, rushed, cruel. They spoke as if something had been taken from them, not as if they had taken anything at all. There was no pause to admit harm, no space for repair, only defense. They said pressure forced bad choices, that life pushed them into corners, that anyone else would have done the same. Each reason pointed outward, never inward. Responsibility stayed distant, like a rumor meant for someone else. Even now, consequences felt personal only when they arrived, not when they were created. What stood out was how quickly they recast themselves. Fear turned into grievance. Exposure became attack. They spoke of stress, of being misunderstood, of how hard things already were. The damage done to me faded from the story. My future, already shaken, barely existed in their telling. Entitlement showed itself in small ways. They expected help, protection, forgiveness before apology. There was surprise that I hadn't stepped in to soften the blow. That assumption lingered longer than anger. It revealed how used they were to being rescued. Listening felt different now. I wasn't pulled toward fixing or soothing. I heard the pattern clearly, stripped of charm. When faced with limits, they didn't reflect. They pushed back harder. When asked to face outcomes, they reached for excuses. In that moment, clarity settled without effort. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't panic. It was refusal. And seeing that made the distance easier to keep. What disappeared for them was never affection. It was comfort built on silence. For years, things stayed smooth because one person absorbed mess without protest. That arrangement felt normal to them. When it broke, they called it betrayal, but what they truly lost was ease. Control slipped first. Decisions moved outside the family circle. Outcomes no longer bent to feelings or pressure. They could not guide the story or soften the ending. That loss felt sharp because they were used to shaping results through closeness and guilt. Secrecy fell next. Private problems reached places where they couldn't be edited or minimized. Truth stood alone, plain and solid. That exposure mattered more than reputation. It removed the ability to manage appearances while harm stayed hidden. The biggest loss was the role I used to play. I was no longer the one who paid quietly, waited patiently, or fixed damage behind the scenes. Without that buffer, consequences landed where they belonged. That shift unsettled them more than any legal step. Nothing was taken from them unfairly. What ended was an arrangement that worked only because one side carried weight meant for many. When that stopped, they felt empty and blamed love. But love was never the thing holding it together. Seeing this made distance easier to accept. I didn't remove myself from care. I stepped away from a system that needed my silence to survive. Recovery didn't arrive as a single moment. It moved in small steps. I started with what I could control. Calls went out to banks. Forms were filled again, this time with support behind them. Flags were placed on my records. Alerts set. Slowly, the numbers stopped falling. They didn't rise fast, but they held. That mattered. Money habits changed next. I tracked everything, even small things. I planned instead of hoping. Each paid bill felt less like a chore and more like proof. Proof that the future wasn't closed, only delayed. Progress showed up on paper before it showed up in my head. Distance helped in ways I didn't expect. Fewer messages meant fewer emotional swings. Days felt longer, calmer. I stopped waiting for apologies or understanding. Silence became neutral, not painful. Space created room to think clearly without being pulled backward. Legal steps followed. Freezes stayed in place. Records were locked down. Access tightened. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about protection. Knowing boundaries existed brought relief I hadn't felt in years. Safety stopped feeling temporary. Emotionally, I changed pace. I didn't rush trust. I didn't explain myself often. New connections formed slowly, without history attached. People knew me for who I was, not for what I carried. That felt lighter. There was no celebration phase, no victory speech, just steady rebuilding. Day by day, I shaped a life that didn't depend on being useful to survive. And that, more than repair or distance, marked real recovery. At the end of all of it, one idea stayed clear. What happened was never about love, loyalty, or family bonds. It was about comfort. As long as I stayed quiet, things were easy. Bills disappeared into silence. Mistakes stayed hidden. No one had to face hard choices. Safety for me was never the goal. Smoothness for them was. Looking back, the pattern was simple. Harm happened, and I was expected to absorb it. When I spoke up, I was told to wait or understand. Silence was praised as maturity. Endurance was framed as strength. Each time I stayed quiet, the system learned it could continue. The moment law entered the picture, everything changed. Not because hearts opened, but because limits appeared. Suddenly there were rules that didn't bend to guilt or pressure. Timelines and records mattered. Consequences existed whether anyone liked them or not. That contrast revealed something painful but useful. Respect only showed up when silence stopped working. I realized then that quiet had never protected peace. It protected harm. Every time I stayed calm to keep things together, damage grew in the dark. Complicity didn't look dramatic. It looked like patience. It looked like understanding. It looked like being told to handle things privately while the cost piled up on my life. Choosing action didn't make me cruel. It made me safe. The law didn't bring closure or comfort. It brought structure. It created a boundary no one could talk around. That boundary mattered more than apologies that never came. It proved that protection shouldn't depend on how much someone is willing to endure. Distance followed naturally after that. Not out of anger, but clarity. I didn't need to argue my worth or explain my choice again. The facts already spoke. I stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. What stays with me now is not the damage, but the lesson. Care that only exists when nothing is at risk isn't care at all. Belief that disappears under pressure isn't support. Safety built on silence will always fail the person carrying it. They weren't shocked that the police got involved. They were shocked I finally stopped protecting them.